An odd-looking man had been pounding on the plastic barrier at the check-in desk while we were in the waiting room, shouting what sounded like a string of nonsense at the poor hospital employee behind it. I was reaching that weird twilight state, where the sedatives make everything seem slightly surreal. The pictures in the magazine I was holding seemed to be moving, and I was pointing them out to my wife, Marianne, who suppressed a laugh in response. I was a bit out of it, but I do remember that he was screaming something along the lines of that he was very sick, and that something was in his body with him, and they needed to get it out. As she led me out of the waiting room, my nurse cheerfully explained the procedure to me, while wearing the brightest smiley face scrubs I'd ever seen. I shot one look back to Marianne, because despite the waiting room being nearly empty, the yelling guy had sat down right next to her, and stared at her while he kept rubbing his eyes. She smiled at me, giving me her "I'll be fine" look, and pulled out the well-worn paperback she had brought with her. Once we got past the door, there was a young woman in a hospital bed. She smiled at me serenely, but there was something weird about her that I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe the way she stared at me without blinking, or how she breathed in odd, exaggerated breaths. It was almost as if she was trying to demonstrate to those around her that she was truly an authentic, living, breathing person. She stared at me with what looked to be curling, delicate black threads emerging from behind her eye sockets, but I chalked that up to the sedation meds at the time. I don't remember much about the scan itself. I'm not sure how long I had been trapped in there for, but it was late morning when I went in, and pitch black outside when I came out. I had come to, in the dark and tight space, to the gentle whirring sound of the machine. There were no doctors, nurses, or technicians in my room, and the lights were off. It was eerily silent. I hadn't realized where I was at first, and squirmed in my post-sedation stupor. I instinctively tried to sit up, and my nose made hard contact with the inside of the machine. They had been kind enough to approve sedating me for the hour-and-a-half-long scan due to my claustrophobia, but then apparently they had just forgotten about me. I pounded on the inside of the awful white tunnel and screamed until I was hoarse, and still no one came for me. At one point, I felt someone tugging me. Cold and clammy hands pulled indelicately at my ankles. But they must have given up, because not long afterwards, I was alone again. I would have thought the whole memory was a fabrication of my drugged mind, but there was an odd, grayish residue on my ankles when I finally got up. I thought of Marianne, sitting in the waiting room, and I didn't know how everyone could have forgotten about me. Surely she would have asked about me when several hours had passed and I still hadn't returned. Eventually, I calmed down enough to release the belt and slowly inch my way out, trying to keep my eyes shut and breathing steadily, not focusing on the fact that my face was so close to the inside of the tunnel that I could feel my own breath reflected back onto my face. I tried to ignore the friction burns as I accidentally drug bare flesh against the smooth interior. In the distance, awful screaming, like I had never heard before, seamlessly transitioned into laughter. Laughter that was so odd it gave me chills. It floated down the silent hallway. At one point, as I walked towards the elevator, I thought I saw small and perfectly round eyes gleaming at me from behind the glass panel in one of the darkened rooms. I told myself it was the last of the drugs in my system messing with my head. That was why the elevator buttons looked to be painted with still drying blood as they lit up. I assured myself, just the meds. I stumbled back the way that I remember the nurse leading me, until I saw something that made me stop cold. The handprints told a story, sloppily written in blood, on what used to be an off-white floor. Pull, drag. From following the uneven and messy tracks, I guess that someone had been hauling themselves down the hallway, using their hands while the rest of them dragged along the dingy linoleum, leaving streaky crimson in their wake. The hallway was littered with what looked like long black hairs that seemed to be moving ever so slightly. At this point, I really hoped that I was just hallucinating. It began from the path to the waiting room, and then continued to the hall that forked away from me, There was so much blood, I didn't know how the person was even able to keep going that far. The smell was overwhelming. I had accidentally stepped into it, and could feel the still warm liquid as it seeped into my hospital-issued socks. I still couldn't blink both my eyes. But those very real feeling sensations, coupled with the absolute lack of people, and symphony of beeps and alerts coming from the rooms on either side of the narrow hall, made it harder and harder to convince myself that I was simply drugged out of my mind. Somehow, despite all the other noise, I could still hear the faint, wet dragging sound of someone crawling through the darkness. I was a bit woozy and desperate to get out, so I called out into the distance that I was going to get help. The sound of raw meat dragging along the floor paused for just a few moments before resuming. I realized it seemed to grow louder, almost as if it had changed direction, and were now heading back towards me. In that moment, I felt dread gnawing at me, and suddenly, I didn't want them to reach me. I felt that something terrible would happen if they did. After heading away from the increasingly loud, wet crawling sound in the hallway, I continued my trek back towards the waiting room. The moist socks left bloody footprints in my wake. The pattern confirmed that I was still weaving a bit as I walked. If I were here alone, I probably would have hauled ass out of the emergency exit door as soon as I saw the blood and whatever that was lurking in the darkness on the floor below. But I could see Marianne's lime green hatchback in the parking lot through a window in the hallway. She was still inside. Even though the trail led from the waiting room, the person crawling through the empty hallway was not my wife. I told myself anyways. She was fine. She'd be sitting right where I'd seen her last, in the waiting room. Some of the doors to the occupied rooms were just slightly ajar, and I tried to ignore the sounds coming from within them. I finally came across the nurse's station that I'd remembered being the last thing between myself and the secured doors. But what I saw there quickly killed any relief that had been forming. There were feet sticking out from just behind the counter. They moved and twitched irregularly. Despite my better judgment, I stepped over the mess of gore in the hallway to take a closer look. The legs seemed to dance to an unearthly melody that only the owner could hear. I saw my nurse, the one who had taken me back for the scan. I was so out of it before that I'd forgotten her name, but not her smile that matched the smiley faces on her trippy neon scrubs. The smile was long gone now. There was still a jagged bit of ribs and torso left above the hip bone and both legs, but the rest of her was just missing. I stared in horror. It took me a moment for my eyes to adjust and see the macabre dance that was resulting of something moving around just inside the gaping wound in what was left of her torso. I could see many of the now familiar, delicate hair-like threads spilling out of her body. They moved in unison, and it almost looked as if the small tendrils were beginning to reform the parts of her body that were missing. It was like watching an otherworldly 3D printer for flesh and bone. I clamped my hand over my mouth tightly to keep quiet, and took a last, long, sad look at the blood-soaked scrubs and the flailing legs. I sped up, and continued onwards clumsily. Despite what I'd told myself, I almost couldn't believe it when I found Marianne, still sitting on a now sticky and saturated chair in the waiting room. Her sweater was slashed in places and stained. An entire arm of the sweater was missing. Splatters and small droplets freckled her cheeks, and the cover of the book she was holding was now upside down, but she looked entirely uninjured. I had a fleeting moment where I wondered where the blood around her had come from, but I didn't care. I was relieved more than anything. The room was in disarray, and a single sneaker, with a foot still in it, peeked out from under her chair. But she didn't even seem remotely fazed by the carnage around her. She stared at me for a moment, almost as if she had to flip through mental flashcards before she recognized me. But I figured it was due to whatever horrible things she had recently bore witness to. On our way out, I heard tapping behind the plastic panel at the check-in desk. Now I made the mistake of looking and saw the young hospital employee from before, gripping the desk desperately, trying to stay upright. His face, which was devoid of any emotion, looked misshapen, as if someone had tried to put together a human face, having never seen one before. Those thin, black tendril-like threads emerged from his eyes, and the cavernous gap where his lower jaw should have been. They were weaving together and seamlessly blending into his skin before my very eyes, repairing what likely should have been lethal injuries. We were so close to the exit when I heard the double doors move and ducked behind some chairs. I tried to pull Marianne down with me, but she stood firm. Shoes and the tattered stained hems of brightly colored, smiley-faced scrubs came into my view. It seemed as if my poor nurse had simply gotten up and strolled away, unperturbed by the minor inconvenience that the entire top third of her body was missing. My wife stared, but didn't react at all to whatever she was witnessing. Eventually, what remained of my nurse walked out the front doors and disappeared into the darkness beyond the lights of the parking lot. We eventually made it back to our car, but I can't drive yet, and she's just sitting in the driver's seat, staring at me without blinking, still and quiet except for an occasional loud, irregular breath. I swear I see delicate threads spilling from under her eyes. I've called 911, but keep getting dispatchers in the next county over. They keep routing me back to my own county, but no one is answering. I miss the moment when I thought waking up after a full-body MRI was going to be the worst part of my day. My wife has been acting so weird since my MRI. We're still sitting here. I'm tired, confused, and have the worst itching forming behind my eyes.